everyone, and welcome in for Bible Study Live. It's good to have you here. I see a couple people in chat already. Hi, Tristan, and hi, Jamie. Welcome in. And as you're joining us, feel free to say hello in chat or just be present with us today. And also, if you're watching this afterwards, it's good to have you here as well. Before we get started, I would love to just give us a moment for us to introduce ourselves. We have someone who has been on Ellis. I know you've been on before. But Moses, this is your first time on Bible Study Live, so we're excited to have you. So why don't we go ahead and we'll quickly go around and just introduce ourselves with our names, pronouns, and how we're connected to TMC. So I'll get us started and then we can jump around. My name is Micah Melody. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Director of Community Engagement for Transmission Ministry Collective.
My name is Moses. I use the pronouns he, him, or they, them, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at Transmission Ministry Collective. So happy to be here.
I'm Ellis. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm interning at TMC through the summer.
We're so excited to have you, both, but also Ellis, so excited to have you here as the summer intern. All right. Well, today we are going to be talking about Matthew 19. It is quite a long chapter, but we couldn't quite figure. There's just so much good stuff here. So we're going to start at the first verse, and we're just going to kind of go through. Most likely, we won't actually make it to the entire thing, but if we do, we do. We wanted to just we'll continue the conversation as long as we have time. And there's so feel free to read along with us. We'll go section by section. We've broken it into a couple of different sections. Feel free to bring whatever version you have. And before we get started reading verses, I believe, Ellis, you had some kind of background information or background thoughts that you wanted to share before we get started.
Yeah, so just to provide a little bit of context about this passage, but also about the Gospel of Matthew, just in general, I thought I would give some historical information. So the Gospel of Matthew, scholars believe, was written around the year 80 in the Common Era. So it was actually written roughly 50 years after Jesus's ministry and crucifixion. So there's kind of two contexts that I have in mind when looking at this passage. There's the context of Jesus's time, the story that's literally being told to us here, but also the context that the people who would have been reading this story for the first time would have lived in and would have been coming to this passage with. And these two contexts have their differences that I'm not going to get into too much here, but they also have some very distinct similarities. This will be important for our discussion today, but both people living during Jesus's time and people living during the time the Gospel of Matthew was actually written would have been sadly very familiar with what life being oppressed under Roman imperialism was like from a Jewish and Christian perspective. I've read some background historical research about this before we met, and also some Bible commentaries on this passage. And there's one theologian I read named Warren Carter who describes it as a work of resistance that stands out and speaks over or against the status quo that the Roman powers at large would have perpetuated during this time. And I think we'll see that a lot as we get into this passage and as we talk about how this applies to our modern context today.
Thanks for the background, Ellis. I'll really quickly grab that and put it in the chat. You were talking about from the queer Bible commentary, right? We can put that in the chat really quickly. All right. Well, would you get us started with reading? We're going to start with verses 1 through 6. So, Ellis, would you get us started? And also please share what version you're using.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. So when Jesus had finished saying these things, the teachings he said before we get to this passage, he left Galilee, and he went to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he cured them there. Some Pharisees came to him, and to test him they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female?" And said, "For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So now they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate."
All right. Well, quite a lot already in these 6 verses, which is why we wanted to break this whole section up a little bit more. Um, yeah, and so also too, as we are kind of going through this, feel free in the chat. Feel free if you have any questions or observations, or things, or maybe tensions or things that are kind of coming up for you. Feel free to drop them in the chat, and we can talk about them as well. Um, is there anything that's kind of standing out in these verses for any of you?
I think for me, something that's standing out is just, and this happens a lot in the Gospels, but the Pharisees trying to trap Jesus. They're trying to have like kind of a gotcha moment with him, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say is like they don't say they came to ask him or they came to like see what he thought about something. It says they came to like test him, right? And they're like trying to basically trap him into something and trip him up. But he's pretty smart, so I feel like he can get around it a little bit, you know.
Yeah, I think that that point gets overlooked a lot in commentaries about this passage, especially. I highlighted verses 4, 5, and 6, because I, I I'm very used to those verses in particular being used as like justification or like anti-LGBTQ like passages, right? Like this idea that, have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female, kind of like as a gotcha against trans people. And then there's also this kind of, people say like, see, even Jesus said these words about like being against same-sex marriage, which is not what this context is about. And then people forget that this is the Pharisees are bringing up divorce in an attempt to test or to entrap. And so, this is also Jesus kind of navigating those things and even showing some of the hypocrisy back.
Yeah, and that just makes me think I like just got out of a Bible study where we were talking about the Genesis piece of like male and female, he created them. And a lot of what we were talking about is like, that's upheld as this idea of like, oh, God created like a binary and that's what was intended, whatever. But actually, the way that like we were seeing it and that I feel like you can see throughout that creation is that it's like God created these things, but also all these things in between and like beyond. And there's all these things that are in between, like night and day. And there's all these things that are in between, like these. And so it's just interesting to like thinking about that piece. And yeah, just like you said, how that's also just been used as really a textile, right, against our folks when I think that's not what the intention is.
Yeah, totally. And then also, the male that's a kind of a linguistic pattern, right? Male and female. We've in Genesis, it's also night and day. I know we're talking about Genesis 1, but this is definitely referencing Genesis 1. And but also we have Alpha and the Omega, right? Like that's the naming the beginning and the end. It doesn't mean it's God's either beginning or end. It's the Alpha and Omega is like this encompassing of the whole. And so, yeah, I think that kind of that pattern that you see in Genesis often gets ignored when we talk about male and female. Um, but yeah, I don't think that it is interesting here. So what I'm curious what you think about Jesus's response in kind of the context of divorce. Yeah, what are your thoughts on like why this response um, or why like the Pharisees are even asking this particular question in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think like right, like I think part of what they're trying to do is kind of bringing them into this question that is really relevant for people at this time, right? Which is this question of divorce and like whether or not, folks get divorced and what that looks like. And I think too, what's interesting, and I feel like we'll probably get into this a little bit in the next piece too, just like the next kind of verses and stuff, is that like I think when Jesus is kind of talking about divorce here, right, I don't think it's necessarily like morality thing of like whether it's right or wrong, like blah blah blah, but I think he's kind of talking about like an economic structure, right, and like an economic agreement that people have made, and like what did it mean to get divorced in this time, right, meant that likely the woman would be left like impoverished, and a system that was already like quite oppressive and like was already quite like violent towards people. And so I think that they're kind of trying to like trip him up with this question of like the kind of like morality of it or like whatever. But I think what he's coming back with is like, actually we have to talk about like economically what this means, or like what this means in terms of like a power dynamic, or like how that kind of exists within a larger structure, which is not what they're coming from. They're probably coming from more of like, hey, if I don't like my wife, can I just like leave her and not feel bad about it and like leave her to economic destitution type of thing.
Yeah, I think the within the context as you're highlighting um, the economic injustice of that would have been imposed on women who are no longer married, right? Who are, and also to the even the stigma of having been divorced and potentially not wanting, or not another, another man not wanting to marry someone who's been already divorced because of the, like certain stigma. um, it's always interesting to me that Jesus grounds this in Genesis, right? Like there is this kind of appeal to Genesis as a way of saying, like, if, I take this as like Jesus saying, like, this to be true of like this kind of thing about how we understand um the creation of people. um and so why are you trying to question like what is like why are you trying to entrap like something that has been there from the beginning? Again, I think this is where what you were talking about, Ellis, the context of the time is important, because I've also read this, as a flat out Jesus is against divorce. And when we talk about kind of divorce in the current sense, I've also seen this passage unfortunately used to tell like people, especially women, that they need to stay in abusive marriages because Jesus is against divorce. And I don't think that that's the context of what is happening. This is again a very contextual thing of response um, to the um, to the Pharisees who are trying to entrap. Um, and Amory, I see a post or a comment from Amory. As far as the biblical record, we have no idea whether or not Jesus was himself actually married or not, which is part of the overall context. Absolutely true. It's We assume that Jesus wasn't married, but actually that's not definitively recorded. And so, yeah, that's a good point, Amory. Any other thoughts on these first 6 verses? All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next verses. And as always, if you have more thoughts and you're just like continuing to think about things, feel free to, we can always talk about them, because it's all of this text is interrelated. So feel free to continue putting comments in the chat, or for us as we're thinking about things, if we want to refer back, we can always do that. So why don't we go through verse 12? Moses, would you mind reading that for us?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm reading also from the New Revised Standard Version. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" He said to them, "It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another commits adultery, and he who is married, who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." The disciples said to him, If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have been made themselves eunuchs for the sake of kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can.
Thank you. Interesting. Are you reading from the updated edition or the okay. I'm also reading from the NRSV, but the original version, or like the first one. And the in verse 9, um it says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery, rather than the full um uh causes her to commit adultery, right? And then he with the addition. So it's interesting, the omission. I'm curious what the textual difference is in some of the manuscripts there for that change. Um, but yeah, what stands out to in this section? There's a lot here. So what are your observations or questions in this section?
Yeah, there is a lot here. I think what jumps out to me the most is toward the end where Jesus says, let's see, he says, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only to those whom it is given. And then he kind of concludes after talking about the eunuchs, let anyone accept this teaching who can. So, like, even though I think people can read this chapter as being kind of rigid, as a rule setting sort of passage, Jesus offers some flexibility. There's teachings that seem to apply to some people's lifestyles, but not to others. So I think that's really interesting.
That is really I think we'll talk a little bit more about this too. The connection between, like, why does Matthew put this here? And if this is recording, Jesus, of like, why would Jesus respond this way in kind of to the disciples' question? Um, but also, why is this, this kind of, why is this put in the connection, or like in this before the next section of like Jesus blessing little children? Um, and so I think um what stands out to me right now was Jesus saying, it was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. So like Jesus is like kind of saying, like, yeah, there was an exception made for this because you knew that it was like, because like it was going to happen anyway. And so within this kind of um there's a way to kind of make the injustice less. But it's still like causing people to like it's still causing people, in this case it says whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity, another commits adultery. But also, as you brought up earlier, Moses, the kind of economic injustice of the whole thing too. I know, Moses, you had some thoughts, like here on kind of the connection in why the significance of like the eunuch passage that's in here.
Yeah, I was like, I was talking to someone about this, and I guess we were just talking about how, like, I feel like biblical scholarship and like an examination of this has so kind of like tied these two passages together of like conflating basically the reason that he's talking about like eunuchs is kind of just because of divorce, right? But versus it's not as much with actually the next part that he goes into, which we'll get to a little bit. But there's like really there's a very little reason to kind of actually like link these two passages together, but you still see it kind of come up. And what I thought was actually interesting is that I really like the Message translation. And I actually, that tends to be where I can go to first, even like, I know it's like, I'm also like, I'm not like a biblical scholar. So I like, how it's translated. And also like, I feel like it was also not the best around like sexuality and gender stuff. And I feel like in particular, it kind of shows up here because when I was reading the Message part, and I'll just read the translation and the Message of verses 11 through 12. And it says, but Jesus said, not everyone is mature enough to live a married life. It requires a certain aptitude and grace. Marriage isn't for everyone. Some, from birth seemingly, never give marriage a thought. Others never get asked or accepted and decide not to get married for kingdom reasons. But you're capable of growing into the largeness of if you're capable of growing into the largeness of marriage, do that. And that's like crazy because it totally takes out any piece of that, right? And it totally just like conflates these two things together. And the assumption is like, oh, Jesus must only be talking about this because he's thinking about people who like can't get married or people like whatever. But like there's actually very little to indicate that. And I feel like we also can take like ownership, and like what he's saying here is basically like for anyone who fits outside this norm, right, of like this norm of, you know, gender or sexuality or whatever it is, like the kingdom of heaven is as much theirs as it is anyone else. And that doesn't have to be tied to marriage, that doesn't have to be tied to anything else, but it's just a kind of a given that because, you know, you are a child of God, because, you know, whatever, you are accepted into these things. And so I thought that was like fascinating. And I also feel like it kind of highlights that like translations can be like quite political, right? And like there are political reasons and like biases of why things are translated like the way that they are and how things are kind of conflated. And so I thought that was really, really fascinating when I was looking at that.
Yeah, thank you. I when I saw that kind of note, I was really fascinated by the, you know, thought of like, why don't we make the connection between this and even how I broke up the passage, right? Like I still the verses that I grouped this section with eunuchs on, I broke it up and I grouped it with kind of this questioning of divorce, right? I think that's, you know, typically how it's assumed to be grouped. And there is actually some textual evidence that that there is some sort of correlation that Matthew is making, because there is a Greek conjunction, de, which is not necessarily where what's translated but in NRSV. That is in Greek, that it's not necessarily it's not a one-to-one for but. It can be and, it can be or, it can be whereas. So it's a way of grouping two kind of phrases or concepts together in a relational way. So there is a relationality to what the disciples are saying, but what you brought up with the Message version is really fascinating to me, because it's like complete erasure and removal of any mention of eunuchs whatsoever, where in the Greek that's eunuchos, which is like for what, you know, actually a eunuch. And so who would have been continue to be a sexual and gender minority of the time. um, and so it is really interesting how quickly people make that correlation of like, oh, eunuch, this must be God talking about not getting married, when that's not the same concept in that cultural framework. Um, but yeah, so it's just a really interesting thing. But the fact that there is that conjunction there raises the question for me of like, why would Jesus choose to respond with this? It seems so out of pocket, like it's like out of nowhere. The disciples are asking like, why do we even get married? Like if this is going to be so, if God's so strict about this divorce and there's like no reason, there's no kind of reason I can even mess up or do any of this, why does Jesus respond with that? And I personally think I read this as a Jesus even calling like, well, you're approaching God with this like very legalistic kind of mindset. But like people who are already outside the bounds already of what we think of as accepted in society are already part of the kingdom of God. So it is this kind of expansive approach, um, but it kind of feels like a logical, like just, you know, Jesus kind of completely changing the subject, which always makes me intrigued. Any other thoughts on like why the response in that way? Also from people who are in the chat too. Any thoughts from you as well?
It kind of makes me wonder, like, I think when you like put it that way, Micah Melody, like, I don't know how to say this, but like, I guess when, right, we're thinking about like what Jesus is talking about and where his kind of like I feel like political platform is and his like economic right, and like he's often bringing in like women's like orphans, like the widowed and like sex workers and all this stuff. And I almost wonder if like a piece of this too is like this is a group that right has been like marginalized in like these huge ways, and it's kind of like I assume it's quite radical for him to like go even like further to say like it's also not just like divorce, like that's one thing, but also like I'm going to take it even further and say that like this other group of people who's also like more marginalized or super marginalized as like this, like they also kind of they also like can be like enter into the kingdom of heaven and like have ownership in that. And like how much is it kind of like him pushing his disciples to like think deeper about how these things are connected and kind of make these connections of like these struggles are all intertwined and all these people are kind of oppressed under the same system and right and are being hurt by the same thing. And so is he kind of like trying to push them to like make these connections that might seem even like even more like whoa, like we don't hear that a lot, or like whatever. And like how much is he kind of just like pushing that in a good way, right, like trying to bring these folks together.
Yeah, I like that a lot of like moving, helping them kind of move beyond this sense of I mean, I think where the disciples are coming from when they ask, like, well, what's the purpose of getting married? Like, if we have to follow this like kind of strict, legal code in this way, that's also partially what the Pharisees were trying to entrap Jesus in was the kind of the nitty gritty of this legal code, right? And Jesus is like, let's get to the heart of the matter. Like there's a exception for divorce because you're hard-hearted, like you're trying to take advantage of these women and leave them without kind of economic resources. Um, and so here, this is another case where like Jesus is like, let's go deeper. Let's kind of push in a little bit further. I like that. Um, any thoughts, Ellis?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed listening to what you both have to share. I'm not really sure what there is to add, but yeah. Yeah, I really like the point about pushing back against the legalistic understanding of morality and marriage ethics. Because I think that the way the Pharisees are engaging is very kind of like in your head and like what's right on paper. But Jesus is really engaging with people's lived experiences and their contexts and who needs help, regardless of what that looks like and how wider society would portray the kind of help that Jesus is trying to offer. So yeah, I think Jesus is really seen as giving a ministry to the people on the streets, basically, in a way that organized religion at the time maybe wasn't able to do so much.
I think a lot of I think a lot of queer and trans people can probably relate to that, right? In today, right? And I want to just say, I think it's always important to be cautious of not drawing a one-to-one comparison between, eunuchs and like trans folks, because the concept of trans identity doesn't, it's that would be anachronistic to kind of read back into the culture of the time. But there are a lot of parallels that we can see, and kind of this approach of like this kind of legal who's in, who's out, can you do this, can you do that? Like how many of us I know for I'll just speak for myself, like that kind of I went through, I within the framework I grew up with of I would kind of like look for all of the possible ways that I might be stepping outside of the will of God in this way. Um, and there is like definitely a lot of that kind of trying to make sure, and it was at a good place, right? It was trying to make sure that um I was doing things to please God, but also in that kind of attempt to do so, I kind of was actually experiencing harm for myself of not being able to just be who I am. And it was kind of definitely it definitely affects people who are like in the queer and trans community. So I think there's a lot of themes here that we can relate to. At least I know I can. I won't speak for everyone, but I know I definitely can. Any other thoughts here before we move on to the next section? All right. I will give us, I will read the next section for us. And we're actually going to only do right now, we're just going to touch on really briefly the next 3 verses. So it might be a little bit shorter of a conversation here. But I'm really intrigued to see how this also, how we tie this back into what we've been talking about. So starting in verse 13, this is also coming from the NRSV. Then little children were being brought to him in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them. But Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." And he laid his hands on them and went on his way. It's just a really, really beautiful image. And the first thing I just caught right now as I was reading this, in verse 12, there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, right? And then in verse 14, let the little children come to me and do not stop them, for it is such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs. There is this kind of repetition of this for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, or also the kingdom of heaven belonging to or being in, and which is I really like that connection. So thank you, Moses, for highlighting the ways that we can even start pairing other passages together besides where we normally make breaks. Any like observations kind of coming out to you in these passages, or questions for either you, Ellis, or Moses?
I feel like, well, when Ellis and I were talking this morning, I was like, I never heard this passage. And Ellis was like, I heard this passage a lot growing up. And so I'd be curious, Ellis, if you like wanted to share a little bit more about where this, like, yeah, how this has shown up for you too.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so, for context, my mom was also my Sunday school teacher. So, I kind of had, um, like biblical education and like at home education from the same person. But that's something my mom always really emphasized to me growing up is that like coming to your faith like a child is the way that you're supposed to do it. So children kind of come with this curiosity and this openness that is sometimes lost in adulthood, and that's a really valuable way to see the world. Um, yeah, and I also remember at the church that I grew up at, we had a stained glass window toward the front of the church that actually depicted this scene, Jesus surrounded by little children. So yeah, that's just kind of a classic image I think of when I think of Jesus.
I also kind of grew up with this passage being talked about a lot. And it's the image of like Jesus. My mom used to have like, I don't know if anyone is familiar with like the precious moments. Those like they're like figurines, like I don't know, porcelain kind of, yeah. So she used to have a precious moments kind of scene of Jesus being surrounded. Of course, it was white Jesus, but like surrounded by kids, and this what's interesting to me when I look at this passage is how the disciples were like actually saying, don't telling the people like, don't bring kids here, thinking that Jesus would not want the kids to come close. It's so interesting because it's like, if this is also Jesus kind of continuing to push them forward a little bit of like, no, the people that you think are out are in. um it's really interesting that the disciples are trying to keep them away, and Jesus is like, no, they belong here. um and it just makes me think of like our current context of like the people, like we don't, like kids right now are, they're not given a lot of like, they don't have a lot of say politically or kind of in power. um, and just thinking of like they don't have access, and there are many like people who try to keep kids away or say, oh, I'm making the decisions that are going to be best for the kids. um, but so just thinking about that and how that kind of connects to today. um, do either of you have any kind of reflections or thoughts on ways that this like passage like touches on kind of our current moment?
Yeah, I know that Moses has some more specific thoughts about queer and trans children, but I think just in general, thinking about the way children were viewed during Jesus's time and how they're viewed now, like in some ways, I don't think we've advanced very much. Like Micah Melody was saying, we kind of deny children their own sense of agency. We deny them their ability to articulate themselves to us about their own identities and feelings. We don't often believe children or see them as having like intellect or value in that way. Um, yeah, I took a class on children's ethics at seminary last semester. And I think something that I really took away from that is that Jesus chose to be incarnated as a child first. He didn't choose to come down just as an adult. So in doing that, Jesus like aligned himself from birth basically with people who are pushed most to the margins in society, who are the most oppressed in society, children. And that's something that he really continued to value into his adulthood and his ministry then, is that children do have theological value and they belong in theological spaces and nowadays church spaces alongside adults. So that's something that I really took away from it.
I see Amory says children are vulnerable and mostly powerless, and yet they can be very wise and insightful, especially about spiritual things, and can know and experience God in deep ways. I think that's really, I mean, absolutely true. I think one of my favorite things is when I'm just like with a child or with a kid, and they're just the most insightful about something, and it just like I'm like, how do you understand that? Or they pick up on things. I think about early on in my transition, they picked up on my transition like before any adults did, right? They just are willing to accept, and it's just really beautiful. But also, yes, the vulnerability, and I think that's really powerful. What you just said, Ellis, um, about the incarnation, like God willingly and choosing to be incarnate first as a child first. I think that that is really powerful, and it really kind of parallels this kind of those who we assume are out, are this is where the Spirit of God is found. Moses, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, first of all, just say like, yeah, on this, it just made me think one of my friends always says that her greatest teacher is like her 4-year-old son because he asks like the best questions and also just like can understand things in a different way where it's just like this doesn't make sense. Why are people like why is this happening and stuff? And so I think about that a lot, how much we can learn from them. But yeah, I think this piece like I feel like I have, so as I said, I never grew up with this piece. I've literally never seen this in the Bible until maybe like last year when specifically like someone was kind of talking about the piece before about the eunuchs and then actually tying it to this piece about the little children and tying it kind of specifically to this context of where we are today of like trans and non-binary youth. And I think that feels so relevant. I mean, with the Supreme Court ruling today, we just see right how trans and non-binary youth are political pawns, right? Are basically people that like the government and those in power and people who are misusing the Bible. They say all these sorts of things about defending children and protecting children, but it's like you were saying, Ellis, what they fail to recognize like the agency that children do have and how children do know themselves. And so the more that they kind of defend or whatever they say children, the more distraught that the kids get, right, when these rights are being taken away from them. And my background too, before I came here to TMC, I worked with trans and non-binary youth, and so I worked in like a mentorship program and stuff. And one thing that like has always stayed with me about that time is just this observation that we came back to again and again, which was that we set up this mentorship program for trans youth to be paired with a trans and non-binary adult mentor, and you would think, right, that in these mentorship conversations, all these kids would want to ask about is like questions about transition and questions about, all this kind of stuff. But what we saw time and time again was that maybe they had some questions about that, but most of all, they just wanted a friend and they just wanted to like seeing evidence that someone could grow up and be like a trans person thriving in society was enough for them. And then they just wanted to be kids. They just wanted to be able to like hang out and play video games and read together. And when we would set up camps and stuff like that, a lot of times what they really wanted to do was just be kids and just have the opportunity to like be able to live freely and be who they are, right? And who they know that they are. And so I feel like this passage is just like it's so tied to that, like in my mind, and so like tied to this idea of like children having the agency and understanding that they are, but like certainly in today's political climate, just like what do you rob children of when you make them into political pawns, and what do you rob children of when you like decide that this is what you're going to rally all your resources and funds about? And how different would our world be if it instead what we were like rallying around for kids was making sure that they had shelter and food and good education and all these things, rather than just trying to police like who they are, and who they know themselves to be too, because they're smart, and they know who they are. So yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Moses. Also thinking about policing, like people policing, like kids having access to God, right? Like even just the kind of um, how many the sad reality that so many children are rejected by families on the grounds of like on religious grounds, right? So like, oh well, we can't support you because this is against God, right? And like that to me feels like let the little children come to me. Like who are we to say, who's anyone to say that a child can't come before God who wants, who and so that type of rejection is so it's so painfully like prevalent, and also it's just, I mean, it makes me really grieve, and especially right now, just thinking about the Scarametti decision, like that came out, that's been on my mind a lot today, and just the weight of that, of kids who we are saying, no, you don't get access to this, like you don't know what you want, or also to you are going to be a bother, you are going to be a bother or a nuisance, and we're going to keep you away from these places where you need to get the care and the belonging and the connection that you need. um, it's it's really hard that like to see that we're still there. Yeah. Amory also says having healthy and happy role models and mentors can make all the difference in a child's life. Absolutely. Yeah, imagine if the disciples actually succeeded in keeping the children away from Jesus, like, and didn't have that connection of that um, role model, mentor, the for Jesus to be able to say, like, I love you and I want you here. Yeah. Well, I want to see if we can get a little bit further in this passage. Any other final kind of thoughts on this? I don't want to rush us on if there is still more that we want to talk about here.
Yeah, I think that Amory's comment that you just read is really poignant. I think that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately as someone who doesn't have children and doesn't see myself having children anytime soon, as I kind of wonder what role do I have in children's lives. And I think that's the answer, to be a healthy, happy role model, especially for LGBTQ kids, to kind of be what I didn't have for myself growing up.
It's powerful. All right. Well, thank you all for your thoughts on this. In the last like 10-ish minutes, I want to quickly try to see. I mean, there's going to be way too much to cover in this, but let me just go ahead and read this for us. We're only going to go through verse 24. Um, so starting in verse 16. Then someone came to him and said, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And he said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. If you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments." He said to him, "Which ones?" And Jesus said, "You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother. Also, you shall love your neighbors as yourself." The young man said to him, "I have kept all these. What do I still lack?" Jesus said to him, "If you wish to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." When the young man heard this word, he went away grieving, for he had many possessions. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." So there's way too much here to unpack like in 10 minutes. We could probably do an entire, maybe we'll come back to this and do another, we'd probably do an entire other Bible study live on this whole second part of the, or this like back part of this chapter. But kind of anything like standing out to you, and particularly how this is like connecting to what we've already read.
I mean, it's just so striking to me that this whole time, like, Jesus is talking about all these people are going to get into the kingdom of heaven, all this stuff, but the one person where he's like, I don't know, it's like a really rich person, right? That's when he's like, I don't know, right? But it falls in line, right, with what he's up against and the context, right, that Ellis was talking about in the beginning. Is there's a lot of oppression, there's mass poverty, there's mass starvation, people are really hurting. And so Jesus is standing up to kind of these forces. And it just makes me think too, like, uh someone once said, like, they're like, I don't like calling the Christian right because they're dead wrong about the Bible. And it's true, because and passages like this make me think that, because they're so fixated, right, on these questions of like sexual and gender morality and stuff like this. But what they fail to ever talked about is like stuff about like how is society organized to make sure that like people are getting fed, people are cared for, people are loved, people have shelter. That is never in their minds. And in fact, the only people that Jesus is saying like you don't get to get into heaven is like them, right? The people who are like basically propping up these violent theologies, right, and these violent policies of let's withhold food, let's withhold shelter, let's withhold access to water and all of these things. And so it's just really striking to me that I feel like this says so much and contradicts what they base all of their theology on.
Absolutely. So one of the things I was like, the idea of a camel going through the eye of a needle, like that image is just, I mean, maybe it's just within kind of those of us, like for me, because I grew up in like a evangelical like church. It just feels like that's such a well-known phrase, like an image, right? But it's so interesting how much people try to twist and kind of get out of the and this is a crazy statement that it's like if you have a lot of wealth, like if you have wealth, it's going to be easier to get a camel through the eye of a needle than for you, because it's hard to lose wealth. It's hard to give it up and to feel that sense of like, yeah, I'm okay with giving, and which is why the man went away grieving, right? Um, and it's so interesting. It reminded me that there was a theory at one point that was proposed that I heard all the time growing up, that the eye of the needle was actually in reference to a gate in Jerusalem that was known as the needle into Jerusalem, and that like it was weirdly shaped, and so it made it like hard to get through, or something like this, and so that was basically to say it's not impossible. It's just it's going to be difficult, but it's not impossible, right? It kind of it lowers the bar, and this attempt to kind of get out of that, of like actually addressing the reality that yeah, this is what Jesus was concerned about, was people being cared for, people having access to food and shelter and clothing and being able to have what they need. And it strikes me too that just like the Pharisees, they were kind of getting into the weeds of like, which is it like, do we can we like, why did Moses like permit divorce, and like is it lawful to divorce? And here again there's this person who comes and says, which commandments am I supposed to follow, right? Like um there is this kind of like, I'm gonna stick to this to be certain that I am in the right and I am good with God, and not and missing the point of like the empathy and the care for the poor and the care for people in need and those who are oppressed. um that's like where Jesus's heart lies. Do you have any thoughts on this, Ellis, or anyone in the chat?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts that are hard to condense, but I think what you lifted up, Micah Melody, is really important. That it's difficult for this rich young man to get into heaven, but it's not impossible. But it also seems like he never considers like following Jesus's commandment or idea to give his wealth away. He hears what Jesus has to say and then he walks away grieving. And it just kind of makes me think about our own economic systems now and how if every or even just a few billionaires in America gave away enough of their wealth where they could still live a comfortable life even, but they could lift up other people and, you know, people would be able to afford housing and food and stuff like that. Like it wouldn't really be that hard. Like it's something that we could do, but also the people who are the wealthiest in the country wouldn't be willing to do that. So, yeah, I think even today we see people like the rich young man who resist Jesus's ideas for helping the poor.
Yeah, I also wanted to clarify too that I don't know if I was super clear when I brought up the kind of the gate theory, but no, I've not found like a commentary that's like, yes, this is the truth. This is like the gate theory to me feels like an attempt to justify holding on to more wealth, right? Because it's like, oh well, it's not impossible, so I can still be wealthy and get into heaven. That's the kind of idea. But in reality, like the whole camel through an eye of a needle is to show just how extremely difficult it is. Like it's not supposed to be an easy thing. Um, yeah. So I agree, Alice. Like I think it's like the people who have the highest concentrations of wealth. I feel like the more you acquire, the harder it is to let it go, because it's like I have it here. And I see a comment from Gracie. I'm just thinking of the insanely rich mega churches just sitting around with so much money. They need to see this verse. Yes, and it's like right here. And um yeah, it's right here. Like and it's kind of crazy that it's not something that it's more talked about. I mean, how many times does Jesus talk about economic realities? And what you were saying, I think it was Moses, I think you were saying like only a handful of times is there anything that, from Jesus talking about gender or sexuality, and yet that's what people focus on because it takes the attention away from the hard kind of reality of the call to care for the poor. And then from Jamie, I wonder if that what the young man did later, maybe eventually he did. That's a really beautiful thought of like imagining beyond that. Maybe there is a possibility that, going away and thinking about it, and at sometime we know it in the story of like Zacchaeus, right? Like there is that turn that happens. But yeah, maybe. And that's a really I think that's a good hopeful place to kind of bring us to a close. So as we close, I just would love to ask, like, what are your takeaways from our conversation today? And it could be like a kind of a key like thought that you're holding, or even a question that you're kind of coming away and wanting to investigate more.
Yeah, I think I just find myself thinking about how broad and welcoming Jesus was, like how welcoming his vision was to people on the margins of society, like children, women, the poor, eunuchs, all of those people. And I think that as a church, we haven't always done a good job modeling that structure. And I'm just kind of thinking about ways that we can heed Jesus's call and speak to those on the margins of society and also see ourselves as valuable when we're on the margins of society. So I think it's, again, not easy, but a very beautiful vision and image.
Thanks, Ellis. How about you, Moses?
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about what you said, Ellis, about like, there's a reason that Jesus chose to be incarnated as like a child first. And, there's like whole parts of, Jesus's childhood that like we don't know about, or, I guess we don't have record of, right? And like the Bible in a lot of ways, but it makes me think of like, what did he experience and as a child and as like a refugee child, and what did he go through that made him into the leader and the thinker that he was, and how was his kind of like program and ministry defined by what he went through right when he was young, and how much is that part of him speaking to the children, speaking to the younger version of himself, and like him wishing that he had someone like that too. So yeah.
That image of Jesus speaking to himself just makes me think of like, yeah, can we be the people that we wish we had? And that's really I really like that. I think for me, my biggest takeaway is again, for I've just really been thinking about it. A lot of it comes down to economic justice, like how many things of just the ways that we fixate on kind of issues that really kind of there's a lot of nuance and a lot of like that Jesus didn't really fully even give the time of day, but what he did give the time of day was making sure that that everyone had what they needed to live, and not just live but to thrive. um and so thinking about that of like queer liberation, trans liberation, it's inherently bound up in how we think about like our economy, our money, our the way that we care for one another and provide and support one another in communities. So I've been thinking about that a lot this recently, and just seeing it again come up in this passage. So I'm going to continue thinking about that. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for your thoughts that you've shared in the chat. A couple quick announcements before we close. TMC will be going on our programming break. We do an annual programming break in the summer, and this is to make sure that our staff get some rest and that our volunteers also get some rest. So we'll be pausing our programming for 2 weeks, from July 6th through 19th. Our next Bible study live was originally going to be scheduled during that time, so we've bumped it back a week. And that means our next Bible study live is on July 23rd. So we will see you back here in July. Thank you for joining us, and hope you all have a good rest of your Pride Month, and happy Pride. Thanks all.